Hey everybody, today we're going to learn about seasoning, spices, one of the most important things in adding flavor to dishes that you're trying to create and proteins you're cooking and soups you're making and everything. You have herbs, which usually come from the leaves of plants, and then you have spices, which are usually the bark, the root, or the seed of plants. So we're going to start off with the basic, the number one, Stana, greatest of all time, the GOAT, NaCl, welcome to the party, salt. Salt is the number one seasoning. If you haven't heard of it, hopefully you haven't been living in a cave, but salt is the base for all seasoning. Salt also acts as a binder on a molecular level. When I say NaCl, it's the compound of sodium and chloride. And when you add other spices, such as all my friends here, like pepper or herbs, it's gonna help bind those ingredients to the thing you're seasoning. Salt extracts moisture, and that's curing. It's helping to keep flavor inside, drawing out the blood, which causes spoilage in meat. Salt attracts other molecules such as pepper, herbs, spices, and adds that flavor and binds that seasoning. So after salt being the GOAT, the grandfather, the godfather, whatever you want to call it, we go with pepper next. You hear S&P, salt and pepper. You see it at the table at the restaurant. You see them in the packages at the grocery store together. They kind of go hand in hand. It's usually salt first, then pepper. Pepper has got a great spice to it. It's not too spicy. It's not too hot. It's not too aggressive if it's used correctly. Obviously, if you do an au poivre steak, you're going to be a little overpowered by pepper, but that's for those of you that enjoy the pepper flavor. It's a great spice. They complement each other really well, and it's pretty much the second standard to go to. Seasoning wise, if you're doing salt and pepper, it's going to be 4-to-1, 3-to-1, salt being the 3 or the 4, and the pepper being the 1. You definitely want to go heavier on the salt than you do the pepper. Pepper is going to be overpowering if you use too much. It's going to give this bitter spiciness on the front of your palate that's going to kind of sting your tongue. So after talking about salt and pepper, we'll move on to one of my other favorite ingredients, fresh herbs. We have 3 great herbs in front of us right now: rosemary, thyme, sage. And you're saying, well, what's up with fresh herbs? I don't understand what the big deal is. Most chefs prefer fresh, in the season. You're going to get the best flavor you can possibly get. There's nothing wrong with dry herbs. You go to the grocery store, you're walking down that aisle, it looks a little overwhelming. You're seeing all these options for spices. There's absolutely nothing wrong with dry for the home cooks, but they're not going to have that same potency, that same flavor. Dry herbs are going to be a little bit more muted. They're great going into sauces and soups at home. But anytime you have the opportunity to use fresh, I highly recommend fresh. Fresh thyme is amazing. Rosemary is great with lamb and with potatoes, and sage with roasted butternut squash or pumpkin. Then you think about your softer herbs that you see in the summertime, your fresh basils, your opal basil, that bright, beautiful purple leaf. The flavors are there. It's in your face. It's aromatic. It's adding another layer of fun to food. All right, so after talking about these lovely fresh herbs, we have dry thyme right next to it. So like I said, there's nothing wrong with dry herbs at all. They're a great substitute. You know what? If you want to do a spice rub and you want to blend salt, pepper, and other things, and you want a nice herb flavor, dry herbs are fantastic. You know, I think about rubbing a chicken, and I wanted to do a nice rub, and I wanted to have a little extra pizzazz besides the salt and the pepper. Why not add a little dry thyme? It's going to take a little bit more of a beating because it's already been dried out. It's not going to be as bold of flavor on the final product, but it's going to withstand some of the cooking a little bit better than the fresh herbs. The fresh herbs are going to diminish in flavor within a few minutes of cooking in a high heat environment. So imparting thyme into a rub or even a compound butter is definitely not a bad thing. We move over to one of my next favorite spices, whole cumin seeds. Cumin is a great spice. You see it a lot in Latin American culture, in their food, and a lot of the pork dishes. You also see it over in India, Northern Africa. Cumin's got a great flavor profile, goes well with meats. Cumin aside, whole spice is great. You get the whole spice, you toast it in a saute pan, or you can put it in the oven and toast it for a few minutes. Either way, I prefer saute pan. You start releasing the aromatics of that spice, then you take it and you grind it. Usually you could do a coffee grinder if you have one at home. Works really well on whole spices, or a mortar and pestle. You're going to get a much more aromatic and in-your-face pop of flavor when you're using whole spices as opposed to ground. These also work really well in stocks or in sauces. Definitely want to get some cheesecloth involved in that process, but these whole spices are going to add another layer of flavor when cooking After talking about whole spices and cumin, next I have some dry bay leaves. This is a common ingredient used in a lot of stocks, sauces, braises, braising short ribs. I love to throw bay leaves and herbs in the braise. Fresh are becoming more available, but usually at a farmer's market, or if you want to buy them at a grocery store, you have to buy a large quantity, and they don't exactly have a long shelf life. Let's be honest, the one downside if you're at home is fresh herbs, fresh bay leaves. They like 50 degrees. Your refrigerator's 32. So you're really going to beat them up and they're going to be bad in a couple of days. So going with dry bay leaf is great. A lot of chefs do it too because they don't consume enough bay leaves on a regular basis to justify bringing in a whole pound of fresh and throwing them in the trash within 5 days. Nice aromatic flavor, nice herbal component to any cooking that you're doing, whether it's a braise, stock, or a sauce. Next up, one of my faves, smoked paprika. Paprika is great if you like spice in your food. It doesn't matter really what part of which country you're from. If you like spice, paprika is great. It's not too aggressive. It's not that in your face like a cayenne or a ghost chili or one of those extremely intense flavors. It gives you a nice spice and a nice layer of flavor without being overpowering and taking too much away from the other spices involved. Usually meat seasoning is where I'm going to use my paprika the most. If I dry rub a nice ribeye, or a chicken or any kind of protein and I want some sort of smoky spice component, paprika is usually one of my favorites to go to. Next up we have cayenne. Cayenne is another spice that comes in the world of heat. Cayenne is also commonly used a lot back in French cuisine and the bisques, the lobster bisque, salt, pepper, cayenne. I remember lovely Georges Perrier always yelling at me, not just salt, pepper, but it was always salt, pepper, cayenne. This is definitely hotter. Spice-wise and heat-wise than a paprika and some of your other mild chili powders that you find at the grocery store. Cayenne is only going to need to be used on a smaller scale, like a half a teaspoon or a quarter teaspoon when you're following a recipe. You see that all the time. It's like, why so little? Because the potency of cayenne is a little bit more extreme. And if you're sensitive to spice, you definitely would want to stay away from it. I like putting it in every once in a while, finishing it in one of my soups, one of my sauces, put a pinch of cayenne on the end, and it kind of gives you that nice heat. But if it's used correctly, it's great at elevating the flavor profile of a dish. After cayenne, we have ground cinnamon. Most of you associate cinnamon with dessert, the holidays. It's actually a spice, though. You can see it in the Middle East, in Northern Africa. It's commonly used in rubs for chicken dishes, meat dishes, and it goes well with pumpkins and squash and that cold weather, warm food, hearty meal, but you do a cinnamon and cumin rub on a lamb, and I promise you, you won't be disappointed. Cinnamon ground is what you're going to find most commonly at grocery stores, and it's easiest to use. Don't be intimidated by cinnamon sticks, but if you're not familiar with them, that's okay. Just like I said before, fresh is better, whole is better, but cinnamon in particular, it's usually easier to work with at ground, and I would highly suggest it. So just covering everything we've talked about and touching on a few more things. Don't be intimidated by spices. Definitely work on using salt to drive the ship, but there's so many other things that you can impart to give flavor and love to the food that you're working with. You're walking down that aisle at the grocery store and you see the different brands and the different bottles and the buy me, buy me, buy me, save, save, save. Really, at the end of the day, as important as you have your salt, your pepper, maybe 1 or 2 herbs, and 1 or 2 spices that you like. Whether you want dry or whole is entirely up to you, whatever is convenient for you. But don't be intimidated. You don't need to run out and buy 50 things at the grocery store because they're all there. Keep in mind that spices and seasoning is to enhance flavor. Enhance. So if you start mixing all of these together in the same dish, it's not going to enhance. It's going to ruin because you start to take away from what you're trying to enhance. If you're trying to enhance protein, use salt, pepper, maybe some cayenne, maybe an herb. If you're going to do something with dessert, pinch of salt actually enhances sweet. Keep that in mind. There's nothing wrong with a pinch of salt. You don't want to do a couple tablespoons like you would in the savory world, but salt's still going to play a role. Maybe some rosemary in a caramel sauce. Take it to another level. Don't be intimidated. Definitely get excited. You don't need to have a lot of spices at home because honestly, spices are only good for a few months, whether they're whole or they're ground. They start to lose their potency. When we get the big 16-ounce containers at the restaurant, you want to shake them first and kind of mix them up because you get that top layer really starts to lose its potency first because it's exposed to oxygen. sunlight, light, oxygen really starts to beat up spices, herbs, seasoning. So you want to be careful. Don't buy too many. Buy a few to start. Play around. Experiment. Make mistakes. If you have any questions, you can always reach out to us. That's why we're here. But have fun. Start off with no more than 5 to 10 and work your way out as you get more adventurous in cooking. But keep in mind, keep it simple. You're enhancing flavors of ingredients that you're already cooking. Seasoning is a way to do that using spices and herbs.